recently you've been writing and giving lectures on the Bible, which is a bit of a departure, it would seem, from Plato and Aristotle. How did that come about, and why the interest in the Bible?
Well, biographically, it's kind of interesting to me. It's really what I started with. When I think about I don't know where I got the idea that when I went to college freshman year, I said I want to be a philosophy major. I mean, we didn't have philosophy classes when I went to high school, so I'm not even sure where that came from. But I think it was I was very into Bible interpretation, Hebrew school Bible interpretation, and was fascinated. And I think that's really is sort of how I came to philosophy. But I will say now that I am so happy I didn't just go directly or have a way to go more directly or choose a way to go more directly. I don't think I would be doing anything like what I'm doing or of the interest it is to me, or I think of general interest, without going through Plato and Aristotle and some of the, Maimonides. Plato, Aristotle, Maimonides, and actually Machiavelli, one of the few moderns I've branched into, has helped me understand things in the Bible. But so I'm an amateur at this. I'm not an expert, and it's very, in our academic world, you don't like to step out of your lane, right?
Right. But they allow you to do that anyway.
A couple informal things came up where I had a chance to do something in the Bible, and I thought, this is so interesting and so meaningful to me, and I've got ideas. Why can't I say something about it from the point of view of political philosophy, And so I'm really struggling with this, and if I continue and do more serious work, I think I have to come up with a little bit more of a method or something than I have. But I feel that I'm asking questions which I've learned from the great thinkers, from the political philosophers, and I don't think that I'm imposing it on the biblical text.
Right.
I'm trying to discover what's in the biblical text, and it's very political. It is political philosophy, very specifically. What I'm somewhat trying to defer, although it's probably impossible, is this big question of the relation between revelation and philosophy. So, you might say it seems a very powerful point that Bible and philosophy are incompatible. There's a conflict between them. Revealed religion and revelation means obedience to divine authority, and philosophy means the autonomy of human reason. And I probably ultimately do accept that. But I think there's something to trying to bracket that abstract question in a way and see what's there in the biblical text. And it's kind of hard to know when you're imposing and when you're discovering, when you're inventing, when you're discovering with the biblical text.
Usually if you go through a text carefully and things start to form certain patterns and pop out when you expect them to pop out, then you're not just imposing it, I think.
I think that's right. And then this kind of assumption we were talking about before, that these I'd like it if it was God. Oh, I've got to tell you my one-line methodological principle. This kind of came up in class. I didn't really want to give my usual rap about how to read a Platonic dialogue. I said, let's just see how it happens as we're doing.
And what were you reading in class, Genesis or Exodus?
Oh, no, this was for the Plato's Theaetetus this year.
Yeah.
So I said, look, I only have one hermeneutic principle. The dialogue was written by a god. And if you accept that, we'll be fine. Accept that for this semester. You can decide to reject it later, but we'll be fine. And by that I meant everything's in complete control. There's a reason for everything. It's the greatest wisdom, and we're trying to figure it out. So now I come to the Bible and I go, read it as if it's written by Plato.
Right.
And I mean, it's crazy, but actually those two, nutty
principles
combination has worked out very well. So, and it was interesting. I was once I think you might have been there. I was once at a conference where I gave one of these Bible papers, and someone who was raised in a very observant rabbinic Jewish tradition, and there was someone else teaching there who said, who had a much more sophisticated scholarly approach to the Bible than I have, was interested in the, layers of composition and that sort of thing. And this young woman said to me, I guess we've been taught God wrote the Bible, but what you're doing with it is making so much more sense to me. That there's somehow a unity and a deliberate reason for each contradictions. Like, let's think about whether there's a reason for the contradictions here or the discrepancies. And there is a sort of unified narrative. I think many people have said this. From the beginning of Genesis to the end of 2 Kings, the history of Israel or something like that. There's a sort of unified narrative. So, that's what I'm doing, and I think they're very common sense assumptions about what biblical authors must have been as smart as we are, right?
Right.
What would they have meant by this, and
Why'd they tell certain stories and not others, and
the ordering, and
right. Report certain details and not others.
Yeah.
There's certainly a huge rabbinic tradition of commenting on that. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just from a slightly different perspective somehow.
they're
than
often
the
more
way-
imaginative, and I
Right.
try to be less willful or something. But,
Right.
and so, and I've kind of gone backwards, like.
Yeah, so tell me, so what have you learned? So
I
you've been
started
reading.
with Moses, and actually that did come from Machiavelli.
Right, great founder, right.
What a man has to do who's instituting new modes and orders. And I realized that when Machiavelli says if one reads the Bible judiciously, you'll see that Moses was like Cyrus and Romulus. Right? And that seems to mean, right, just he's using the Bible for his purposes. That's fine, perhaps. But the more I read it, the more I kept thinking, no, he's actually giving an accurate. I think he's finding what.
Machiavelli's finding an accurate account of
what the biblical authors might have had in mind. So this was partly coming from the golden calf story, where people sort of tend to overlook this, that when Moses comes down from the mountain, he sees this idol worship, and his whole project is at stake. Everything is at stake. This is a crucial moment for new modes and orders. And he has to do something very ruthless. And he says, thus saith the Lord, whoso is on the Lord's side, come to my side. Put every man your sword at your side, and kill your brother and kill your neighbor. And then his own tribe comes to his side, and they kill 3,000 people. So that's a drastic moment, right?
Right.
And I realized, I think Machiavelli did understand this. There's a kind of civil war. Kill your brother, kill your neighbor. It's a civil war. And it's some kind of terror. And it's a moment it's a founding moment, and something drastic is being done. I'm not sure I have understood fully what this is all about. But,
Right.
And I am assuming that there's, for the biblical authors, a good end for this. It's not, just violence or something. But it is kind of, shocking to read the sense of fratricide turning into civil war. So, and then I realized God didn't say this. The page before, Moses is talking to God. God never gave this command.
So this is Moses ascribing or
Yeah.
taking the authority of God to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. When one goes through Exodus, and I only did this a tiny bit, when you read about what the author, if I can call it that,
Yeah.
reports about what God says to Moses, what Moses says about God saying to Moses,
Exactly.
it's not always the same
And
thing.
so, you can't have a knockdown argument about this. I mean, it might be just different authors threw in different things. And
Right.
stuff. But I actually think that an author or authors who were thinking about this would know that they could have easily put into the dialogue page before that God gave this command. So I think that's a sensible principle to read. I'm also assuming, by the way, goes back to my dialogue theme, because I was so bothered for so long. Okay, it would be nice if God wrote it and it was one author, but if you don't want to be stuck in just philological work on layers of composition, which doesn't make you think, it's too easy a way to dispense with the issues that you can think about on a different hypothesis. And the way I'm looking at it now is a dialogue.
Yeah, and I do think it's not really, I don't know much about this, so I'll say this at some considerable peril of being wrong or corrected by intelligent viewers, but I don't think the Jewish tradition is exactly that God wrote the Bible. It's that Moses wrote the Bible.
Yeah.
Or it's God somehow inspires Moses to write the Bible through the hand of Moses.
Yeah, and by
but
the
there's
way,
a little even in the tradition, there's a sense. It's not, there's a little distance from, let's say, a literalistic understanding.
And by the way, what I would appeal to there, it's really interesting. I do have the list. It's so, talk about contradictions. At one point, at least the law that God's giving him, at one point God wrote the tablets. Then the next, a couple chapters later, Moses wrote them.
Right.
It goes back and forth a couple times. So even the biblical authors can't decide, right?
Right. Well, it seems like they want to call attention themselves to the problematic character of it, since famously Moses wrote the 5 books of Moses, as we call them,
Right.
and famously Deuteronomy ends after the death of Moses.
Right.
So that's such an obvious problem that
you've gotta
obviously that would have
explain that.
occurred to some editor or redactor or author.
Yeah.
If they wanted to, they could have just ended,
Yeah.
with the death, and it would have been like a
Yes.
novel that's told by someone, and of course the novel doesn't continue after the narrator
Yeah.
dies.
They
But
gotta
they
account for that.
purposely want to raise the question, it seems,
I
of the
think that's
relation
exactly
between
right.
Moses and the text. And
Right. And what this idea of what God, what is God and what is divine inspiration.
Right.
And, here Plato helped me a lot. Plato's Statesman has been very influential for me. In the Statesman, you have one of the most important, I think, discussions in Greek philosophy about law and the statesman. So it looks like that, the highest political standard would be the wise man on the spot, who knows exactly the right, precise action for this very particular situation, which will never be the same again. And by the way, that was crucial to my understanding of Aristotelian prudence or phronesis. That's the same idea. And in this very dialectical discussion in The Statesman, you start with that, and it gets undercut until you end up somehow, very complicated dialectic, but you end up with a defense of rule by law. However imperfect law is, that's the best we can do. And we never use the phrase second sailing. I'm kind of surprised I talked all this time without using that.
Go ahead and use it. Right. Explain it.
That comes from the Phaedo.
Right.
And it's a kind of colloquial metaphor about rowing the boat. When the wind is in your favor and the sails, that's lovely. But when the wind isn't there and you have to row the boat, that's a second sailing. It's more laborious. It's seemingly a second choice when the first best is not available. And Plato uses this everywhere. Aristotle uses it very often. And I think the real gist of their argument is what you thought was best, turns out you really didn't understand that the second best is the real thing, and therefore, in a sense, the best. And yet, all of their thinking requires postulating this first best to understand why it's a false illusion. It's a kind of strategy of thinking that operates. And so you can see it in this case we're talking about, right? It looks like the first best is the statesman on the spot, because human actions and circumstances and people are so individual and so relative, right, that you need... No, it can't work. That certainly not public or political. You need law. So, okay, so the statesman thing, and it starts like this. If a doctor who would know the exact right prescription, but if he's going away, he has to leave something behind in writing. That's the first move, that the statesman is going to have to withdraw. And again, by the way, if I can go back, you can see that this is what I had in mind also about the end of Socrates' life. He's not going to be on the spot anymore. The statesman belongs in that sequence of the 7 dialogues.
Right.
And the philosopher on the spot is gone. There's going to have to be some kind of replacement for him. So, okay, so law is the replacement for the statesman. And in this, the statesman has to withdraw and leave the law sovereign. And you know the story probably that Solon wrote the Laws of Athens and then left for 10 years
Right.
with the rule that nobody could change anything while he was gone. Law to be if you have the wise man there or the legislator there, you can always appeal behind the back of the law.
Right. Right.
And that undermines the authority of law, because law is so imperfect and so general. And so in The Statesman, I definitely won't try to describe this crazy cosmic myth that the universe has 2 epochs, and at one point it's twirling one way, and then, but in any case, that there's a myth, and the myth is about the withdrawal of God. In one cosmic epoch, there's a God who is at the rudder of the universe, the helm of the universe, steering the whole universe in divine providence. And everything is cared for. It's the Garden of Eden, by the way. It almost sounds exactly like the garden. There's fruit hanging, there's no labor, and so forth. But then some things go wrong in another epoch, the God withdraws. So the Statesman gives you a mythical picture of the withdrawal of God reflected in a political picture of the withdrawal of the statesman. That's been that's kind of one of my guiding themes in reading the Bible, reading the Hebrew Bible. that even if you just look at the surface, right, God is not involved all that much. I mean, there's a pattern
Right.
to God's intervention. He does create the universe, and that counts, I'll grant you.
Right.
And then he, sends the cataclysmic flood. That's a pretty big intervention. But, and he withdraw, there's periods of withdrawal. So one way I understood to go back to the Moses story and then work our way backwards, the end of the Moses account is that his grave won't be known. He doesn't get into the promised land.
Right.
To me, that sounds so much like the Statesman point I'm using, right? That he can't be present.
Right.
He has to withdraw. He's transmitted this divine law. And if the divine law is going to be authoritative, this legislator has to withdraw. You can't now appeal behind the back to what would Moses say. Well, you could ask what would Moses say, but he's not there to undermine the law. And I want to say I think I'm probably having to leave out a lot, obviously. But I think that there's a story of God like that going on. And in a way, maybe this is kind of obvious what I'm saying. It's partly about Judaism and Christianity. You really do have two sort of logical possibilities, right? If you're going to have a God, an incarnation or withdrawal and rule by some kind of divine law.
Right.
And
I suppose you could argue that God's interventions in Genesis and Exodus are always necessitated by failures, so that he has to come back in with Noah or with Moses after Joseph's project seems to fail after 400 years, and but then I guess with Moses he really gives them the law and then steps back, right? There's not much intervention by God after that.
Right. So I really think that's right, that it's like a series of false starts. I mean, the one thing that just seems so obvious to me on the surface of the biblical text is how much lack of omniscience and omnipotence this God of the Hebrew Bible has, or at least of this 5 books of Moses has.
Yeah.
From the beginning of creation, things start getting out of his control, I think. The grass is grassing on its own and things like that. Then, of course, the Garden of Eden and the corruption of the way of all flesh on earth, the Tower of Babel.
Right.
And then I'm very interested in. So here's the question. Should I go on a little bit?
Yeah.
One of the questions I'm most recently interested in is. I started with Moses. That's a peak. It makes so much sense. The Plato, Maimonides, and Machiavelli explained it all to me and everything. But then I started thinking, what is Genesis doing there?
Right.
Why doesn't the Bible start with the divine revelation of the law to Moses?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm willing to grant you need those first 11 chapters to make it universal. God created the whole universe, and human beings become human through their own rebellious acquisition of knowledge of good and evil, and then, they have to develop the arts and so forth. Then the first big, I think, difficult question is, many people, I think, would agree with this. We could name names, but we won't get started. Many people would agree that the story seems to be showing you something that the human condition cannot solve on its own, I guess I would say by nature, and you're going to need law as a solution.
Right.
But I think the first problem is, why does this law have to be for a particular people?
Right.
Which the Tower of Babel, so now you have the
Deals with
fragmentation
that.
of
Right.
humanity. And that's a big question. That's a very difficult question. The particularity or the of this distinct peoples. Why can't law be universal? Or there is universal law, but why is that so minimal? And why?
Right.
So that's one big question. But then I'm also thinking, I think even harder in a way, okay, let's grant that. That's the attitude of the biblical authors. Then Abraham is going to be the start of this. But certain things we might want to go back to in a minute. He fails, I would say, to be he can't, and it might not be his nature. It might be that the father of an extended family is not the legislator.
Yeah, I've always been struck by that, though.
Yeah.
In the Jewish religion. It's sort of counterintuitive when you think about it for a minute.
Yeah.
That the father of the Jewish people, Abraham, our father, that's what we call him, right, is not the
founder.
not the founder
Not the
somehow.
legislator.
Yeah.
It's not going to be, if the identity is going to be based on law in some way, the blood relation or the family is not sufficient. So, okay, for a lot of reasons, and there are some other reasons that we could go into in
Right.
a minute about Abraham's own character, I think. But in any case, he's not going to be the legislator. But then why doesn't the Bible go from Abraham to Moses? That would be the logical thing, right? Let's get to this revelation already. I think it's absolutely remarkable, the detail and depth and elaborate story of these 4 generations. I want to go back. I read probably the last novel I read in my life many years ago was Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, which I loved.
Is that right? I've never read it. Yeah.
Oh, I read it when I was living in Germany, and it seemed very perfect. But he has this line in the opening line of the novel is, "Tief ist der Brunnen der Vergangenlichkeit." Deep is the well of the past. Shouldn't one call it bottomless or something like that? He's going backwards. He's starting, and he's taking a biblical image. Like, you're told Isaac redug the wells of his father Abraham.
Right.
So he's looking at and he's telling his own version of the story. Why did it go through 4 generations, right, unfolding? Why did we need that? What is Genesis doing there? That's really intriguing me now. And, one of the ways I'm thinking about it is God does have an interaction with these patriarchs. Obviously, he comes to Abraham, right? And several different times that we might want to talk about later. Anyway, he comes to Abraham several times. He comes to Isaac once, or sort of twice, but once mainly to tell him, don't go down to Egypt, that's it. He has a lot of interaction with Jacob, some complex interactions with Jacob. No interaction with Joseph.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And Joseph is a major figure.
Joseph is the biggest segment of the Genesis. And what is really fascinating to me right now is, can I go into this detail?
Yeah.
Okay. When God comes to Abraham and tells him this promise, he puts him into a deep sleep. A deep, dark dread comes over him. And he gives this prophecy. Your people will be enslaved for 400 years, and then you'll be freed. And Abraham wakes up and he doesn't say a word about it. He never tells anyone. He doesn't ever shown to be thinking about it again. So, I wondered what happened to that.
Right.
It's sort of in the background for the reader.
Right.
But none of the characters act with knowledge of this bigger plan that's supposedly governing the whole story. Okay, so you go through the whole of Genesis and you get to the end with Joseph. And remember, he's revealing himself in the end to his brothers, who don't realize that he's the governor of all of Egypt now. The boy that they thought they maybe killed, and suddenly he says, I know you meant evil against me, but God was using your evil intentions for a larger divine plan for the good. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and it struck me that how interesting that the one and only character in the whole of Genesis who ever talks that way about a larger invisible hand, using human passions for a greater purpose, is the one guy who never had any interaction with God.
Right.
That seems so very strange, right? There are a lot of moves one could make, but I think that. But then I just started thinking again. In a certain way, his vision is very limited. Like, he doesn't what he thinks is, I was put here to save you from starvation during this famine.
Right.
And that's good, he did save them. But what he's also done is consolidated all of the power and all of the property of Egypt in the hands of Pharaoh. And that's going to be the source of enslavement for the Egyptians too, and for his own people for 400 years. So he doesn't see the bigger divine, if there is a divine plan.
Right.
His vision doesn't extend that far. And so my the big framework that I'm working with in all this is, I guess it's a question of causality. How does the Bible, what are these relations of these planes? There's a divine plane, I guess, but they show human characters of such recognizable human judgment and passions and actions
and choosing to act in the way they act, not simply being driven by divine
no sense
necessity,
of puppets, really,
apparently.
right?
Yeah,
choosing. What's the causal connection here? How the biblical authors see that? I think has been an interesting framework for the whole the whole
Oh, that sounds
account.
great. Well, there's so much fascinating stuff in the Bible, just from my very limited
Yeah.
study of it, and connections back and forth between Genesis and Exodus,
Yeah.
and reflections on Genesis and Exodus, and the Christian scriptures as well. So
Yeah.
this will be a fruitful topic for you for the next
Yeah.
X number of years.
Another thing we could say about Joseph that's interesting is, especially by the end of the story, where he's hiding himself, he's testing the hearts of his brothers, he finally reveals himself.
Right.
All of those verbs are words about God.
Yeah.
He's acting like a hidden God, testing the hearts of men, revealing himself at the proper moment. So you start to get an impression of this is the Hebrew Bible's version of an incarnate.
Right.
What would it mean to have an incarnate God? And it's being rejected. I might have mentioned this to you once. I'm struck by the last words of Genesis are, Joseph died at 110 years old. He was embalmed and buried in a coffin in Egypt. It's like a dead end.
Right.
That's the end. That would be the end of this divine promise. If you stop there, right? It so happens 400 years later you will have
Right.
God reappear out of a burning bush to Moses, but you don't know that at the end of Genesis. There's something, another false start.
Yeah.
The Bible the Hebrew Bible is rejecting this possibility in some way.
It is amazing that the first of the 5 books ends in a failure, in a sense.
Very
Or
deep,
dark,
dark,
almost.
right?
Yeah.
Embalmed in a coffin in
I
Egypt.
mean,
And he does
and then the next book begins with
yeah.
Hebrews enslaved and
Yeah.
so forth.
And one way I thought about it, I learned this from Robert Sachs' commentary, and I wanted to say something about David Daubert. But anyway, Robert Sachs says, Exodus 3, you hear, Moses, Moses, here am I. It's an exact echo of, in Genesis 50, the last words of God in the book of Genesis are weird. Jacob has already learned that Joseph is in Egypt, and the brothers are bringing him down to Egypt. He has very dark vision, too. He says, let me see my son once more, and I want to die. But he is going to go down to Egypt, and he's already made the decision, and they're en route, and they stop in Beersheba, which is kind of the border land for everything. Mm-hmm. And God appears in a vision of the night, and he says, Jacob, Jacob, and he says, here am I. Exactly the same phrase as with Moses. So Robert Sachs, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, very useful book, I find, he says, it's as if the two conversations converged and all the time between just disappeared. And I love that. But then the more I thought about it, I also think it's almost the opposite, that there's a kind of borderland or empty space in which Joseph dwells between the life of the patriarchs who have an interaction with a personal God
Right.
and rule by law that
Right.
Moses is going to bring about. And Joseph is representing something that's, in between.
Yeah.
After the
Or
Great
maybe
Generation.
Joseph is the more natural outcome of a sort of divine revelation, you might say.
Yeah.
But then has to be corrected by the
Law.
law,
I
which is
think
given to
I
Moses.
have a set. I mean, I don't know how much this is
Right.
imposing, but that feels like a way to understand
Right.
the whole trajectory to me. This scholar David Daubert.
Say a word about David Daubert. and then
David
we'll
Daubert
close.
doesn't have the recognition or publicity he ought to have, and his student Caleb Carmichael, who's also a very interesting interpreter of biblical texts,
Right.
has collected all his work, and so it's available. But I've learned a lot from him, and he's very well versed in New Testament and the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic tradition. I mean, he was one of those German educations where
Right.
he was originally Roman law
Right.
and knew all the languages and everything, and then biblical law, Talmudic law, New Testament studies. So he has one of his many interesting articles is about how much Jesus, betrayed by Judas for so many shekels, is parallel to Joseph, betrayed by Judah. He tries to argue it's not just accidental.
Right.
And when this is all coming from the Gospel of John, when Jesus says to Pilate, I know you meant ill to me, but you wouldn't have had the power unless God were working through you for his own purposes, using your evil intentions. Some of that passage is almost a paraphrase of what Joseph says to his brothers about this divine plan. So that's kind of interesting. Dauba never like pontificates about drawing big conclusions. He just observes these fascinating things. But it fit my picture that in a way, yes, this is what Joseph is, this kind of possibility of incarnation and why that's being rejected.